Hey, welcome everyone. My name is Ann Stanton and I'm the Executive Director of the National Writers Series. We are a year-round book festival, usually held at the beautiful City Opera House in downtown Traverse City, Michigan. Your support and attendance mean a lot to us, and thank you for zooming in. Tonight, Elaine Weiss will talk about her book, The Woman's Hour, The Great Fight to Win the Vote. Before we get started, I'd like to talk about the national protest over the tragic death of George Floyd. The shocking video of his last minutes of life awakened us to our country's systemic racial injustice and the need to make fundamental change. I hope tonight's conversation about the women's 70-year fight to vote will provide inspiration. Before I introduce Elaine and guest host Susan Odgers, I'd like to recognize our sponsors and this year's winners of the College Scholarship Competition. It's co-sponsored by NWS and the Grand Traverse Regional Community Foundation. Enjoy these short videos.
Hi, my name is Athena Gillespie, and I was recently awarded the Robert and Marcy Bransky Poetry Scholarship for a poem I wrote entitled An Elegy to My Father's Mother. I just graduated from St. Francis High School. I am also a student in Front Street Writers, which is taught at the Career Tech Center in collaboration with the National Writers Series. I will be studying social work at Grand Valley State University starting this fall. Thank you from the bottom of my heart to Marcy and Bob Bransky. I truly want to change the world in a positive way, and I believe that writing is a skill that will enable me to do that. With my writing, I want to create a space for others to be heard and a platform for my own voice as well. I want to tell people stories because I stand firm in the belief that all people are valuable and loved. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Olivia Johnson, and I was awarded the Judith Lang Creative Writing Award for my story, The Snow Globe. I recently graduated from Interlochen Arts Academy, and next year I will be attending the University of Victoria in British Columbia to study creative writing. Thank you to the late Judith Lang, who loved the Writers Series and fully endowed the fund, and Marcy and Bob Bransky, who have volunteered for NWS from the very beginning, and for all the others who have donated. Writing to me is a form of self-expression that I've found I connect with on every level. Thank you again.
Hi, I'm Erin Evans. I was awarded the Community Foundation Leslie Lee Nonfiction Scholarship Award for my essay, The Love Came from the Mess. I just graduated from Bel Air High School and was also in the Front Street Writers program, taught at the Career Tech Center in collaboration with the National Writers Series. Next year, I'll attend the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. I'm not sure what I'll be studying yet, but it will be something related to writing. Writing is how I reach an understanding with the world and share my own ideas. Thank you to Leslie Lee, an author herself, who fully endowed the fund.
Hi, my name is McKenna Landrum, and I was awarded the Bill Montgomery Fiction Scholarship for the story that I wrote called Starlight. I am a junior from Grand Traverse Academy, and I also go to the Front Street Writers program from the Career Tech Center. The fiction scholarship was named after the late Bill Montgomery, and he was a writer and businessman who served on the National Writers Series board. And I wanted to thank his wife, Anne Montgomery, and for all those who donated to this scholarship.
Thank you, Ben. Ben Whiting, for those great videos. I would now like to introduce Susan Odgers. She's a strong activist in the Traverse City community. Since 2008, she's written a Record Eagle column about disabilities and health issues, and she'll publish her own book this year. She serves on the boards of the Traverse City Human Rights Commission, Michigan Writers, and the Traverse Area District Library. She teaches at Northwestern Michigan College, and she has been twice honored as a Ragdale Foundation Artist Fellow. Award-winning author Elaine Weiss has worked as a Washington correspondent, a congressional aide, speechwriter, and as a university journalism instructor. Her bylines have appeared in our nation's leading magazines, and she's been awarded prizes from the Society of Professional Journalists. Elaine lives in Baltimore, Maryland. The Women's Hour has won the 2019 Silver Gavel Award. That's the highest honor of the American Bar Association. Steven Spielberg, no less, is adapting Elaine's book for television, with Hillary Clinton serving as executive producer. Please be sure to buy a copy of her book at your favorite bookstore and to support NWS. Thank you. I know you have lots of questions. Click on the chat icon at the bottom of the screen. Just go to the bottom of the chat screen and type in your question. Susan will get to all your questions, well, hopefully at least some of them at the end of the conversation. Now, please join me in welcoming Elaine Weiss and Susan Odgers.
Welcome everyone to NWS. Welcome Elaine. And I'm wondering for our sight impaired folks and folks that are listening, if we both could just describe what we're wearing and what we look like. So you go first, Elaine.
Well, hello everyone. I wish I could be with you in the beautiful Opera House in Traverse City, but I am in my living room in Baltimore, Maryland. I'm wearing a sort of blue-green jacket, and I have light brown hair and blue eyes and a fair complexion, and I'm sitting here pretty comfortably and eager to talk to you. Again, wish I could see everyone and we could all be together, but this is, I guess, the next best thing.
Thanks, Elaine. I'm sitting in a wheelchair. I have long red hair with bright red glasses, and I'm wearing a sash that says vote on it from a good friend of mine. Jill Robinson made this for me, and I'm wearing yellow roses in a corsage that other friends contributed to tonight. So thanks for that, Elaine. Elaine, we're going to talk a lot tonight about you as a writer, but maybe you can tell us a little bit about you personally, about your husband and your family. Let's start there.
All right. Well, I am married to a university professor, and he is a professor at Johns Hopkins University, a professor of physics and astronomy. And we have two grown children, Theodore, Teddy, and Abigail, Abby, and they are professionals in their own right. And I have worked much of my career as a journalist, and for the last decade or so as a nonfiction book author. So I think the training in journalism certainly helped my writing of nonfiction books. I think journalists often write history, often write those kind of books that tell us not only where we have been, but perhaps with hints of where we are now. And if journalists write the first draft of history, then I think narrative nonfiction writers write that second and third.
Okay. Elaine, both of us know that we start tonight's interview with great gratitude to our foremothers and sisters. And let's start by going back to the summer of 1920 in Tennessee. Kind of set the scene for us with the sensory impressions back then.
Sure. Now, let me explain why we would ever want to go to Nashville, Tennessee in the middle of summer of 1920. And that's because that is the scene for the final political battle over the 19th Amendment, which is the constitutional amendment which grants the vote to American women. And it's been 7 decades that the suffragists have been fighting for this. And it was stalled for, the federal amendment was stalled for 40 years in Congress. And it's finally emerged in 1919. It's gone out to the states for ratification. And now this is possibly the last state possible to ratify. And that means the 36th state. It takes 36 states, 3/4 of the states in the Union. Then there were 48. And so American women are holding their breath and seeing whether Tennessee is going to ratify. And so all of the forces supporting ratification, supporting women's suffrage, also those who are opposing it, men and women, pour into Nashville. It's a particularly hot summer in Nashville. Everyone's complaining about the heat in the when I read their letters and their journals. It's a fraught time. The world has just emerged from a terrible, terrible catastrophe of World War I, what was then called the Great War. In America, there's enormous anxiety about what America's role should be in the world. There is a sense of wanting to isolate ourselves from the rest of the world. There is labor strife. There's actually been in fact, 2,000 labor actions in the past year around the country. And in Tennessee, there's been quite a bit. There's racial strife. There are riots, many, many riots that are racially motivated in cities and towns across the country. There's a lot of anxiety about immigration. Does this all sound familiar? It's very much what we're also facing today. So American women are looking to Tennessee to see whether they are going to have a voice in the 1920 presidential election, which is going to really set the direction of the nation for the next decade and longer than that. And American women want to be part of that. Now, the women in 15 states can vote already because they have won the vote by their state action. But it's quite clear for those other states that they will never be given the vote by their states unless there's a federal amendment which will supersede all the state restrictions. And so in this heat, in this tension, in this sense of the suffragists are actually also divided. There are rifts in the suffrage movement. There is, you have the presidential candidates, their minions coming in. You have political activists, you have corporate lobbyists, and they all pour into Nashville for what promises to be a huge fight.
Okay. Elaine, tell us a little bit about where the title of the book comes from.
The Woman's Hour, yes. It has a very clear historical grounding, and that comes from towards the beginning of the suffrage movement. And something that I explain to my readers is that the suffrage movement actually emerges from the abolition movement. Most of the women we think of as the foremothers of the movement, Susan Anthony, Elizabeth Stanton, Lucretia Mott, Lucy Stone, are activists for abolition before they turn their attention to women's rights. And there is a real bond between these issues because both, of course, African Americans are enslaved at this time. American women have no legal rights. And so there is this sense of the spark of divinity is in all people, and we should work towards the freedom of all Americans and the right to vote. We are a democracy after all. And so the abolition movement and the suffrage movement are like sibling causes through the Civil War. And afterwards, there will be a break only because they're pitted against one another. And Congress says, well, no, only one group can get the vote. And we often see this, powers putting disenfranchised and powerless and voiceless citizens against one another to lessen their power and to divide them. And this is what happens after the Civil War. And the nation is told that the suffragists and the abolitionists who've been working so closely together are told, no, the nation cannot handle two big reforms at once, can only do one. The woman's hour has not arrived. The woman's hour will have to wait. And so it'll be another 50 years until, as Carrie Catt, who's one of the lead characters in my book, she's the president of the mainstream suffrage organization in the nation, and she declares the woman's hour has now struck. And so that's where the title comes from.
Okay, great. That's a good segue, because a lot of folks have wondered, where did Carrie get her start? And your young reader came out June 2nd, and I'm wondering if you could read one of those passages from the young reader about a young Carrie Catt.
Sure, I'll just explain here. This just came out a few days ago. This is the young reader's edition of the adult book, kind of slimmed down, streamlined, written for a pretty broad age group. And we just launched it yesterday. I had Dr. Carla Hayden, the Librarian of Congress, helping me do that in conversation. And it was really quite wonderful. So I'll explain. Carrie Catt, again, one of the main characters, you'll find her in Nashville. She's the president of the National American Women's Suffrage Association, which is the largest and most powerful suffrage organization in the country. She's also the president of the International Women's Suffrage Association, reminding us that the fight for women's suffrage was an international, it was a global fight. It was a global issue, and women around the world were trying to convince their governments to give women the vote. And again, we should also remember that the United States is the 27th nation to give women the vote. We were not in the vanguard at all. So Carrie Catt is, in 1920, probably the most famous woman in the world. She lectures around the world. She's a brilliant orator. She was the protege of Susan B. Anthony, who chose her to bring the movement into the 20th century. But she begins, as we all begin, as children. And I think it's important to realize, one of the reasons I wanted the book to be adapted for young readers, to realize that children are very aware of the world, and they are very capable of spotting very clearly injustice, and they feel deeply about it. And also that political action, commitment to a political cause, often begins in childhood or in young adulthood. And it's a personal experience that brings you to a political or social cause, and the personal becomes political and vice versa. So this is a little description of how Carrie Catt comes to the idea of women's suffrage. Carrie Catt had been battling for women's suffrage for so long. As her train sped past rural, tree-lined landscapes, she could still feel the sting of the very first time she had confronted injustice towards women. Back then, she hadn't yet known women's rights was a cause she could fight for. Carrie grew up a pig-tailed Iowa farm girl, curious and a bit of a bookworm. She often borrowed her father's newspapers, and she liked to chime in when her parents talked politics at the dinner table. Carrie's mother, especially, was very well read and informed about so important important topics. Carrie wanted to be just like her. But on election day, 1872, with Ulysses Grant facing off against newspaper publisher Horace Greeley for the White House, 13-year-old Carrie had watched, confused, as her father prepared to ride into town to vote for the president, while her mother remained at home. "Shouldn't you be getting ready to vote with the other grown-ups?" Carrie had asked her mother. The whole family laughed. She still could remember the embarrassment, the hot tears welling up. Women weren't allowed to vote, her father explained, as if it was the most obvious thing in the world. Only men are allowed. Voting is much too important to be left to women. Carrie was immediately angry. Her mother knew as much about the candidates and the important issues as her father did, and maybe even more. She deserved to vote for president. And worst of all, this meant that one day Carrie wouldn't be allowed to vote either. She did not take kindly to rules that made it seem like she was less important, less smart, or less capable than the boys were. So Carrie decided to dedicate her life to changing the laws that barred women from voting.
Thanks, Elaine. I'm wondering if you've been able to meet any of the descendants of the key players in your book. Can you tell us about that?
Well, yes, that's always the fun part. Now, of course, when you write history of a century ago, and of course, my story begins in the middle of the 19th century, so I couldn't hope to really meet some of those characters. But I've been fortunate enough to meet several of their descendants. I've met Elizabeth Cady Stanton's great-great-granddaughter. I've met Carrie Catt's great-nephew in Iowa. I've met descendants of several other of my characters, and met a great deal. The younger women who are names that we normally hear in the standard national suffrage histories. One of the things I wanted to do in this book was to bring to light that this was not a movement of a couple of leaders back in the 19th century and then it was all done. It was a movement of millions of women and men. And it was, there were leaders in every town, in every city, and in every state. And I wanted to bring some of those to light, especially in Tennessee, and especially in some of the other organizations that were working towards suffrage besides the mainstream one, the national. And so there are some wonderful young women in their 20s who are on the front lines. And I got to meet some of their descendants. And in one, the great niece had just donated her papers to the Schlesinger Library, the great library of American women's history at Harvard. And she allowed me to go through the unprocessed box. This is really exciting for a researcher. And to see some of the letters and the notes and the memoirs of her great aunt. And that was so wonderful because you get a sense of who these people are. And that again was one of my goals in this book. Again, when we read, if there's anything written about women's suffrage in our history texts, and there was not usually a lot, it's usually a sentence or two. It's usually American women asked for the vote at the Seneca Falls meeting in 1848, and then in 1920 they were given the vote. And that's about as far wrong as you can get. And so I wanted to not only tell the history in a more realistic sense, the battle, the bitterness, the extraordinary opposition that women confronted in trying to bring equality to American women, but also to let my reader understand that these were women and people, and they were not icons, they're not saints, they're not two-dimensional historical figures. If you ask someone about women's suffrage, they usually can name Elizabeth Stanton, Susan Anthony, and that's it. Mm-hmm. And so I really did want my readers to understand these women, especially as people, their vanities, their insecurities, their enormous courage, their personal backgrounds. So as much as I can, I dug that up from the archives.
Well, Elaine, I think most of us think that we've had to do so much of our own work to learn our women's history for the very reasons you just described. And your 3 books do a tremendous job at helping us with that. So just on that point alone, I really want to thank you. Can you tell us a little bit about your writing process? How do you go about such a tremendous task?
Well, anyone who writes nonfiction, especially historical narrative nonfiction, begins in the library or begins in the archive. Research is the foundation of this. And I will, since this is a writer's series, I'll share with you one of my favorite reactions, only because it's kind of interesting, but I do get letters from readers and comments when I tour around, and people say to me, "Wow, I just loved your novel," and I thank them because I'm great. I mean, it's a great compliment. I consider it a great compliment. And so I thank them, and I then have to explain. I said, if it reads like a novel, I am very, very happy. But I have to explain to you that I couldn't make anything up, that there are 750 endnotes at the end. You don't have to read them, but they're there. And everything I have put in the book has been cited, and I have the source. And I can't make up anything, any dialogue, any action of my, so I'm restricted like that, but there's a great world you can describe. And so I'm in the archives. That's where I am. I have to first find where the material is, and that's usually a great hunt. I mean, that's the exciting, it's treasure hunting. You find where material is, and then you have to go there. And you spend very intense days. Usually you stay in the cheapest motel, and you work night and day in the archives. And again, it's been very interesting to see the technology change as I've researched the book, my books, and how you can get things digitally now, but you still have to be in the archive. A lot of the deeper stuff has not been digitized. So I'm in the archives. If I'm lucky, I can then buy microfilm and bring it home and use it at my husband's university. And I spend months in airless, windowless rooms in the microfilm reader, and your eyes kind of get cross-eyed. So that's the first part. And then at a certain point, you have to say, even though this is great fun, I have to start writing. And there's always that moment, and every writer has their own moment when they realize they have to start writing. And it doesn't mean you ended the research, because you're always going back, you're always filling in missing parts. But then you have to start assembling it, organizing it, making it retrievable, starting to build your narrative arc. And that's when the fun begins, and that's when the real work begins for a writer of historical nonfiction. And I love it. I love both parts of it. I often think of it as I joke with my friends that I'm writing journalism with dead people, which really means that I use a lot of those skills of building a story, of hearing the voice of my source, and I can't interview them, but I do have their letters, their memoranda, their quotations in newspapers, their sometimes autobiographies. Those are very rare, actually, from what I can find. But they do sometimes have, retrospective things they've written. And so I do have their voices. But I have to gather them in a different way. And then I have to write it as any writer would put together a vivid story. In this book, in The Woman's Hour, I had to use techniques I'd never used before. And I had to learn how to use them, especially suspense. Okay. Now, there's whole genres of writers who use suspense all the time, but I, as a writer of history, had never had to use that, and even as a journalist did not have to use that. And so I had to learn the pacing, the beats that you have to create so that your reader knows, the reader knows certain things at certain times, and you withhold certain information from them. Because one of the things I had to do, everyone sort of knows how the story ends, the story I tell. We can vote, but I needed to make my readers forget that you know what happens. I needed to make you nervous. I needed to make you feel, wow, this might not pan out.
Yes.
Because that's what the suffragists felt. So I had to make you feel hot and miserable and scared and frustrated and all those emotions that I know the suffragists in Nashville felt because I'm reading their accounts. Mm-hmm. So that was my job. And it was a little different than I had ever done before. So I had to learn a lot of writing techniques and pacing techniques that I never had to master before.
That's fascinating. Thank you for giving us all that. Yesterday, you and I were talking about some of the ironies that women could run for office, but they couldn't vote. And I'm wondering if you can tell us a few more of those disconnects that women have traveled with this topic.
Well, there are many. When the movement begins to get traction, the idea of women's rights in the mid-19th century, it's instructive to realize what women couldn't do. I mean, it's almost hard for us to fathom. It's not just the vote. It is that women have no property rights. Now, this is dictated by state law, but in general, they had few, if any, property rights. And a married woman especially had absolutely no rights to the wealth she brought into the family or the land she brought into the family. They belonged to her husband. Any wages or any property she gained after the marriage belonged to her husband. Her children belonged to her children belonged to her husband. She had no custodial rights. So if she left the marriage, she left the children. She was not allowed to testify in a court of law or to serve on a jury or to bring about a civil action. She had no legal rights in that way. She was, as the suffragists called, civilly dead. And so, of course, she couldn't attend most universities or colleges or professional schools. The clergy, everything was pretty much closed to her. This improves as the 19th century progresses. But there were some things, again, this is all in state law, which were not prohibited. And so it meant that in many cases, women could actually run for office, even though they couldn't vote. Now, the reality was, who was going to vote for a woman for any kind of political office, and until women could also vote. But there are some interesting examples. Women in some states are allowed to run for school board because that's considered an extension of the home, education of children. And so they're able to vote in school board elections, in some states, and to run for school board. So you see women entering the political arena in that way. There's a wonderful story I tell in the book of Elizabeth Cady Stanton running for Congress in 1866 in New York. And of course she loses, but she thanks her 13 male friends who voted for her. And so you see this, there are women running, once, especially in the Western states, women do win the suffrage by state action. You see women running for Congress, for Senate right away. It's hard for them to get any traction, but they start. And of course, the first woman who serves in Congress, Jeanette Rankin from Montana, because Montana women can vote. And so that's an explanation. It's also true that there are about 5 or 7 women in state legislatures by the time the 1920, when ratification occurs. Okay.
Elaine, we're getting pretty close to opening it up to our questions, but before we do, you and I know that over 408,000 people have died from COVID-19. We have the protests related to what Ann talked about at the top with George Floyd. We have long lines in the Georgia vote. Tell me and our audience some of the concerns and hopes you have for our democracy.
Well, that's a tall order, but it's true that I think my story is relevant, and I wish it wasn't as relevant. I wish it was just a sweet, important story of history. But it's not just that, because the fight for voting rights is not over. The fight for inequality and racial equality is not over. The 19th Amendment does give the vote to all American women. But as we know, it did not extend to women of color in certain states. And I want to explain that because it's important. The 19th Amendment does say you cannot be denied the vote on account of sex. In the southern states, that will be subverted by Jim Crow laws that make it harder for Black women to vote. Of course, the 15th Amendment guaranteed the vote to Black men in 1870, and the southern states had managed to disenfranchise them. So until the Voting Rights Act of 1965 put some legal teeth into enforcement, and Congress never has the right to enforce this and never does. So let's put the blame where it deserves. And in the Southern legislatures, there are these Jim Crow laws, which will make it, poll taxes and literacy tests and onerous hurdles to voting, which are backed up by violence and intimidation. And again, we'll talk about Native American women who are also not allowed to vote after 1920 because Native Americans are not considered citizens until afterwards. And then even after the federal government says they can, the states are very slow until I believe it's 1860. I get my centuries a little mixed up. 1962, that all Native peoples who are citizens are allowed to vote. And then Asian American men and women do not get the vote until late 1940s. Here we are in 1920. Pardon me. Here we are in 2020. You see, I write my checks with 1920. So we're in 2020, and voting rights is still an issue. We saw those lines in Georgia yesterday. We saw them in other states before. We're facing probably an election by mail because of COVID and the danger of people gathering in polling places. The suffragists had to face a pandemic in 1918 and 1920. They had to curtail a lot of their campaigning. But I think the important lesson is that this fight for voting rights is not over. It wasn't over in 1920. It wasn't even over in 1965 when the Voting Rights Act, the enforcement clause, the fifth clause, was eviscerated by the Supreme Court in 2013 in the Shelby County versus v. Holder decision. And now we see an explosion of voting rights restrictions and suppression measures in the states. And I think we as a nation have to make it loud and clear that this is not acceptable. Voting rights isn't a partisan issue. I know it's being tried to be portrayed as a partisan issue. It is not. And it's as I call it, a stress test of the health of our democracy. And are we willing to let that go? Are we willing? We fight wars for democracy. And yet I think we need to rise up, as we saw wonderful protests in the last week around America about injustice. We need to stand up for voting rights as part of this sense of injustice, because the voting restrictions are being targeted to minority communities. So this is a civil rights issue. It's still a civil rights issue. Suffrage is always a civil rights issue. And I think we need to understand what we're confronting today.
Thanks, Elaine.
Elaine and Susan, thank you both so much. I think we have a couple of questions on deck for Elaine.
Okay.
Dr. Jessica Reichert, we're going to start with you. Welcome.
I'm glad to be here. It was a wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
Well, Elaine, I want to share with you an example of systemic racism historically. Sadly, we American Indian women cannot celebrate 100 years of suffrage because we were not included in this privilege until 1962. In 1924, Congress enacted the Indian Citizenship Act, which granted citizenship to Native Americans born in the United States. This act was in recognition of the valiant bravery of the American Indian soldiers in World War I. Because the U.S. government left it up to the states, as you have mentioned, and they decided who had the right to vote, it took 38 years for all 50 states to allow American Indians to vote. In 1962, Utah, the final state after many lawsuits, allowed Native Americans to vote. So now, finally, women's suffrage included all women. Elaine, do you agree that we women need to support each other, moving forward with kindness and determination? Thank you.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that question and for those details. I think all of these examples of women and men not being included in our democracy really raises larger questions about our ambivalence about true democracy and our fear of true democracy. And I think it's a conversation we need to have over and over again. And it's clear that for political gain, that we've been willing to keep large swaths of our citizens without a political voice. And that, I think, brings into question our view of ourselves as a democracy. And so these stories are really important, and we do have to learn from them. And women working together, I hope we learn some lessons from the suffrage movement that we could have done a much better job of moving together. But it's also true that in any large movement, you are going to find rifts and disagreements, if not on principle, then on tactics. That's what happened in the suffrage movement in terms of a split bit in the movement of how to go about, what strategies to enforce. And then, of course, you see African-American women and Native American women and Latina women working for suffrage, but having to work in their own organizations because it was such a segregated society. So I think we need to explore that and study it and learn from mistakes. Absolutely.
Elaine, we have fabulous questions, and this was true even before tonight happened, all the different things people have wanted to ask. But Shelley is asking us to talk a little bit more about some empathy for the antis and where they were coming from, what their driving force, their strategy. Say a little bit about that.
Yes, well, the anti-suffragists are such a fascinating aspect of this story. It's usually, there were many people who did not support the idea of women voting. The antis are usually referred to as the women who oppose their sisters getting the vote. And I prepared a little bit of a slideshow. If you'd like, I can show some of the anti-suffrage images that they used in, I could say propaganda, but I'll just say the way they express themselves. And some of this is men expressing anti-suffrage ideas. But Ben, if we can cue that up, I'll be able to show people. These are pretty strong images. This is what I would do with the suffragists. Again, it's about keeping women quiet. And that's a timely subject too. We can have the next one again, peace at last, keeping women silent. The idea of women speaking publicly, marching, demonstrating. Of course, women were demonstrating in Lafayette Square for suffrage, where we saw protesters again last week. So women speaking out, having political thoughts was very scary to a large portion of the population. The anti-suffragists tried to portray suffragists as ugly, mannish, spinsters. Who would love a suffragist? And why does a woman want to vote? She should have a man who will vote for her. So you see these kind of images. Here's another one coming up. Guess which one is supposedly the suffragist? I won't give you any clues, but this is how suffragists were portrayed. And again, when you think about how women politicians and candidates for office are critiqued about whether they are too strident, too loud, too pushy, too smart, how they dress. You see a lot of these images echoed today. Here's another one. Yeah, so suffrage was going to destroy the American home. It was your wife, don't you want her home taking care of the children, or do you want her on the street corner as a zealot for suffrage? And this was aimed at men who would be voting in a state referendum. Of course, only men could decide whether women deserve the vote. And this was giving him a pretty binary choice. And the next one, this was what's going to happen if women can vote. When women vote, mom smoking cigars and reading the sporting news while dad is holding the screaming infants and having to make his own trousers out of her discarded skirts. So this is going to upend the American home and family. And the next one, again, election day, mom's going to sail out of the house, abandon the family. Dad's going to have to take care of the screaming kids. The apocalypse is coming. And this is the kind of imagery that was used to scare the American men, that this was a dangerous concept. It was going to affect private life. It's going to affect you in your home. This isn't just a political issue. This is a personal issue, Mr. America. And, you know, they weren't subtle about what they were worried about. And here's another one coming up. America when feminized, and again, mom walking off the nest, and she's wearing a Votes for Women sash, and the rooster calls after her, Ma, the eggs are going to get cold, and she calls back, sit on them yourself, old man, my country calls me. And one of the taglines is, a vote for the federal suffrage amendment is a vote for organized, female, nagging forever. So if that's not a great bumper sticker, I don't know what is. And then I think we have one more, and this is pretty self-explanatory. Bed of trouble, man hovering under the bed, and his wife has the whip. This is what the suffragists had to contend with, besides many other more pointed, even more pointed assaults on their personhood, and also they were called socialists, Bolsheviks, unpatriotic, subversive, dangerous.
Elaine, we have quite a few questions where folks want to know what you're working on next, and also an update on the TV series.
Well, I'm beginning some research on what might be a new topic. It's really too early to even describe. I hope it'll sort of continue the story of gaining rights in more modern times. But of course, I'm a little stymied because I can't travel to archives. And of course, I'm not touring as I hoped to be doing now as we approach the centennial, the real 100th anniversary in August of this year. But I think the celebrations of the ratification of the 19th Amendment and women's right to vote is going to be pushed into the next year. Centennial Plus, as one organizer explained it. And so that's where I am there. And the TV series is in development and moving forward, a little slower than anyone thought, but it's going ahead, and I hope we'll see that as soon as possible. I also want to say that how much I'm indebted to the work of the League of Women Voters. One of the things that I didn't have time to explain is that the League of Women Voters are the daughters of the suffragists. They come out of the suffrage movement. Basically, the mainstream suffrage organizations all around the country changed their names to the League of Women Voters. And they are also celebrating their centennial, and they are on the front lines of fighting voter restrictions and voter suppression at the national level and at the state level. So if I can give a plug to join your local league, as I have.
Thank you. Elaine, we also have a question. People are wondering about the Spanish flu because of what we're going through right now. What was one of the key ways that affected the movement?
Well, when the influenza, and the reason it's called Spanish is so bizarre. It has nothing to do with Spain. But the influenza pandemic arrives in the United States during the spring and summer and fall of 1918, and it's extremely deadly. And the suffragists are actually campaigning. They're campaigning in Congress to finally get it out of Congress. They're campaigning in the states because 4 states are having referenda on suffrage. And they're also campaigning in other states in 1918 because they're trying to flip the Senate. They're trying to get some pro-suffrage senators in there to finally get it out of Congress and into the states for ratification. So they have to suspend all of this activity. They have to go to doing it by mail. Of course, there's no television, there's no radio even in 1920. So they have to use the telegraph. They print up broadsides that they tack on trees. They go door to door. Well, they can't go door to door. They can't have meetings. Conventions and rallies are totally called off. So it really hampers them, but they persevere. They keep going, and they wear masks when necessary. And they write in their reports that this is really hampering them, but they appeal to women, take out ads in the newspaper. They use all the forms of communication they can.
So actually, we can take many things from their playbook today to use this year.
Absolutely.
Yes. So we're also getting some questions about, tell us a little bit about Michigan in particular, since the Writer Series is based here.
Yeah, Michigan has such an interesting history. You worked for many years through the 19th Amendment, through the 19th century, trying to get suffrage, bringing it into the legislature several times. It fails quite a few times. There is, I believe, at least one referendum campaign, which again is not successful. And then finally, I believe, towards the end, the Michigan legislature does, I may have to bone up on this, but I believe that Michigan finally does give women the vote and then ratifies. In fact, Michigan is one of the first states to ratify. It gets into competition with Wisconsin and Illinois. Who's going to be the first one? So again, I want to check up if I'm correct on when suffrage, if there was state suffrage, because I have to tell you, I've spoken to audiences in 4 states in the last few days. So I may be confusing that, but I do know that it's one of the first to ratify.
Thanks, Elaine. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone who is with us tonight. I just want to encourage you to go to your local bookshops and buy Elaine's books. It will be a wonderful gift to you and to other people that you care about. And the National Writers Series really needs you now. If you can make an extra donation or a first-time donation, we really need your support now. Thank you so much, everyone. Good night.
Thank you.